Woo!
This hangout on air is live. Is everybody surviving?
Yes, that's right.
John, you don't even know how mysterious you just managed to look.
It looked like you just got like raptured up to the sky. Like your chair was just spinning and nobody was in it.
You're like that corgi in the picture, right? Where you're taken up to meet your people. Has everybody seen that corgi picture? My daughter is wild about corgis.
I've seen that one. It's good stuff.
Yeah,
I
I
love
haven't seen
a long
that,
dog. I have a basset hound myself.
Oh, well, that's
We have
good.
a corgi. We have a corgi.
That's right. I forgot about your corgi, Bonnie.
Yes, we have a corgi.
So we can probably get a little bit of an inquiry project going here on favorite dog breeds and why. So I'll be watching TweetDeck for that. But while we're waiting for the dog breed advocacy to begin, I'll simply say that this is a Google Hangout to talk about the role of librarians in thought vectors, what's going on with inquiry proposals and the library and sources and citations and scholarly communication and all those things that the exorcist of ignorance and the information sorcerers have to bring to the conversation today. I think I got that right, didn't I?
Yeah.
Okay, so why don't we just take a moment to introduce ourselves in case that has somehow leaked out of folks' brains. Gardner Campbell here, one of the instructors for UNIV 200.
Ryan Kales, another instructor for UNIV 200.
Hi, I'm Jessica Gordon, another instructor.
John Becker, also an instructor of UNIV 200 this summer.
Enoch Hale, observer.
Friend.
You come in peace.
I'm Jenny Stout. I'm one of the librarians at Cabell Library and the course librarian for this MOOC.
And I'm Laura Garrepy. I'm also one of the librarians at Cabell, but you can think of us as librarians just in the world. And you can think of me as Jenny's backup, so to speak. So you guys deserve so much great library attention that there are two of us.
You know it. That's what the connectivity is all about, right? Pretty soon we'll have some video of RVA on parade in support of thought vectors and concept space. That's my vision.
Let's do it.
The entire metropolitan area doing thought vectors and concept space going down Broad Street. Thank you. One parade. Good night.
I want a virtual float.
We can make that happen for you, young man. We can do that. So here we are, bearing down on inquiry projects, thinking about some of the things that are assumptions we have about what is a research project, how do you frame it in terms of language, in terms of the sources you use, in terms of citation style, or do you do citations at all? We were talking about some of this Monday night on the Hangout, but now we have an opportunity to talk with folks who are working right there at the interface of learners and the information science that can actually provide a platform for effective and kind of pioneering use of information resources in support of learning. And let's start out by talking about this whole idea of sources. So when you go to find evidence or a conversation or some kind of thoughtful work to support or enrich or complicate or somehow be a part of your own inquiry project, where do you start with that, librarians? I'm coming to you and I want to talk about education. I want to do my inquiry project on education. Surprise, surprise. But where do I go to start thinking about that?
I mean, I think you could go to any number of places. Some people like to start at Wikipedia. I think it also depends on how much you already know about your topic. If you're picking a topic that you have no prior knowledge of, I would recommend going to Wikipedia to just get some background information. And also, I always say to learn about how people talk about your topic, because there's a way we talk about stuff out there in the world, and then there's a way scholars or writers or people who have really looked into it, they use different words, basically. You know, a lot of times students do benefit from just putting a few keywords into VCU Library Search just to kind of get a sense of the articles, the academic articles that the library has. But also a Google search is a good place to start too. I mean, you're just going to get different resources. And I think really the goal at first is to see what's out there, and also see if, based on what you're finding, if you might end up kind of like figuring out the path that your research is going to take. Because obviously education is like a good place to start, but then you would want to be forming a question, right? What about education? What level of education? You know, that kind of thing. So I would recommend looking in a variety of places, at least to begin.
So talk some more about that shift in language, because I think students run into this problem a lot when we're talking about education, let's say over lunch, or student talking to student about the topic of education. That doesn't necessarily match up in terms of the vocabulary or even in terms of the direction of the conversation when you start to get into scholarly areas or you get into other kinds of conversations. And so could you talk a little bit more about, I think of it almost as a mapping exercise. How do I take the way I'm thinking about it and find the terminology or the conversational directions that may not be using my language, but they're actually going in a direction I want to go in? How do you do that?
Well, I mean, the more the more you read about a topic, the more information you're going to have on it, and the better sense you are of like how different people talk about it. So, for example, if you're a student, you're like, I'm interested in education. You might talk about school and teaching, but you may not know about the word like pedagogy, right, or pedagogical methods. And then even if you do know that word, you might not know what some of the classic pedagogical methods are yet. And so that's something that you can only learn by doing some of that background research and getting a sense of, well, how do teachers talk about education? How do elementary versus high school versus college teachers talk about education? How do scholars talk about education, right? And yeah, I mean, you'll definitely find, so a part of it is just reading that stuff and kind of gathering those keywords. Also, you know, as you'll notice, I mean, I could talk about like subject terms, subject headings. Like if you search in VCU Library Search and you click on an article you really like, a lot of times there's these links at the top that will say like, you know, American education dash 20th century, and that's like a convenient way to skip around to articles, but they're not very intuitive. You wouldn't necessarily know what those subject headings are just off the top of your head, but they can kind of be used for inspiration. And yeah, I mean, I really think the only way is to kind of just be reading about the topic and learning about it.
So that brings up one more question, then I promise I'll stop and let other people get in here. But it's really interesting because to hear you talk brings up all of these memories of trying to work with students through their research projects. And I find that often students believe that books in the library are all really, in the end, kind of reference works. So you should be able to go and look up things and find information and then plug that into your paper. But the way you're describing it it's clear to me that really what you're doing is entering a conversation. It's like going into a room of teachers or scholars of education or this or that and listening to the conversation to get an idea what is this conversation like, rather than looking at a book as just a place where you look up a piece of data and then you put it in your paper.
Yeah.
So how
Definitely,
do you articulate that?
I mean, well, I think that you have to articulate that it's a process. I always tell students when I'm working with them, I always say, like, don't think of research as linear. Like, I will come up with the perfect research question. I will find 10 perfect articles. I will read the articles. I will write the paper. The end. I always try to tell them you have to have, like, an inkling of what you're interested in to begin with, but then as you do research, you may find either a more specific path you want to go down, like you might go from, oh, I'm interested in high school education, to I'm interested in the use of iPads in high school education. Or you might find a completely different path than the one you were on. So maybe you were like, oh yeah, I want to look at about iPads in education, and then you might say, well, wait a second, like I'm reading about all of this stuff about Google Hangout in education, and that's really more interesting. So, and you know, students get stuck on this whole thing of like, no, like this is my topic. I must make the research fit into my topic, rather than I may need to tweak my topic to fit what I'm finding, what's interesting to me, the available research, that kind of stuff. So I always try to tell them, you know, it is not a linear process. It's a cyclical process, if anything. And that can be frustrating to students because I understand that it's not just, I mean, generally speaking, they're not taking just one class. They're taking a whole bunch of classes, and they're trying to manage their time. And so this idea of, I might have to go back and do more work, I might read 10 articles and only use 5 of them, they're like, oh, it's a waste of time. But actually, it's not a waste of time because you are gaining more knowledge, even if you read something you don't end up using in your paper. So if you try to frame it that way, I think that at least the students' expectations might be changed a little bit, and they might be more accepting of, okay, well, I can kind of go down this path, go down that path, and not feel like I must stick to the same path. I don't know if that answers your question.
Sure, absolutely.
And I would just throw out there, it's interesting that you kind of bring up this research or scholarship as a conversation. I was kind of stalking around on some of the Thought Vectors blogs today and saw several instances of that where maybe you enter the conversation through what you find online for free. You find a great summary of a report, for example, from the American Heart Association on a larger study. So you've got someone telling you about something else, and you can kind of peel back these layers. It's like a scholarship, conversation / onion, all sorts of layers that you can kind of work through to get to the original source of the information, which I think is something that is often a new concept as new researchers work through that process, that you really do have to dig into the citations, or even if not an explicit citation, kind of the reference in the text to another study can be really, really helpful for students to engage in that conversation.
So if I was a student and I was exploring a topic and my frame of reference is, yeah, I'm going to think of these as conversations, what are some questions I could ask these authors as I begin to unpack their work, and specifically to help my thinking be a little bit more efficient? Like, what are some general questions you might give to me as a student to help me enter the conversation or figure out the conversation?
One that comes to mind for me right away is kind of asking the author, now that you've done your research, you've presented your idea, what would you have done differently? What did your study not cover? That kind of thing that helps you understand the limitations. I think a huge part of the research process is knowing what you don't know, and that speaks to some of what Jenny said of you're going to absorb so much more information than you're actually going to report on. So that's one that emerges right away for me if you were to sit down and chat with the author.
Yeah. I mean, I think this might become apparent in their by reading their work, but sort of like, what angle is that person taking, and what are some other angles? So you know, what are some counter arguments? If the person is making an argument, what are some counter arguments to that? And what is that author's counter argument to that counter argument, if that makes sense? I always think about some people in University 111, 112, 200 already do this. They have their students like write out like a dinner table scene where
Bonnie does that.
Yeah,
do that.
I know.
Yes,
Bonnie
I do.
And it's the most fascinating thing, because the whole point is, like, you don't want a table with 10 people all just parroting each other and saying, yes, I agree, yes, I agree. You want to get some different viewpoints in there. You want to see the spectrum of viewpoints. So one thing is to I would ask the author is, like, you know, well, I've seen your perspective, but what's another perspective? And, you know, presented with evidence from the other perspective, how would you counter argue against that? Because I think that keeps the thing going. And it doesn't have to be like, I agree, I disagree. It can usually, it's more amorphous than that. That's why I said different angles, you know, versus different arguments, I guess. So that's something that at least fascinates me when I do research.
Right, now that's really interesting, because a lot of students will think about argument as also a kind of a linear thing. You take a position, you stand there, you agree, you disagree, but you're talking about something that's actually more perspectival than that, right? So people are advocating claims, but not in a binary sense. They're saying, if you think about it this way, here's what results.
Right. Yeah, that's true. I mean, I'm trying to come up with a good example. One could simply be like, if you look at like an interpretation of a work, you know, if you took like The Great Gatsby and you said, let's interpret it various ways. I mean, there's a feminist interpretation, there's a queer reading, there is a Marxist reading, there's, you know, deconstruction, symbolism. No one is right or wrong. It's just different people with different backgrounds coming at it and looking at it in different ways. And the same could be said of anything. It could be even the most divisive issue, even an issue like abortion or gun control. it's not just yes and no. It's like yes, but no, and what about this issue? What about this radical viewpoint? And I think that that's really interesting to see all those viewpoints and to kind of, I mean, I guess, you know, whether or not, depending on what the structure of the paper is, like, where does the student stand? Like, what do they, given all this information they have, what do they think is, you know, the answer or the best way to approach it? Or not. Maybe that's not the point of the paper. Maybe the point of the paper is just to explore the different viewpoints.
I think a lot of times, at least in my work with students, especially in 200, there are some topics where you'll find that the literature or the information available does kind of lean heavily in a direction. But what I find is, it echoes what you said, Gardner, that it's never as binary as yes, this is the way to do it, and no, this is not. I'm thinking of an example where I helped a student who basically wanted to write her argument in her paper was going to be that people working in fields that involved, I guess, radiation, that there should be more precautions taken to protect them from said radiation. And we had to kind of have a conversation about, well, it's pretty unlikely that you'll find sources that openly advocate, no, we love radiation, let's eat it up.
Yeah.
But the argument at times might be, yes, and these are the kinds of ways that you can do that. And this one, it turns out, is not so effective, so maybe we should take that off the table. And I think that's a really great learning experience of this course, and it's one of my favorite ways to be involved in the research process when students realize just, it sounds really cliche, but how complex the world is. It's rarely a yes or no answer. And that's a cool thing that research can teach.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the example that I was thinking, and I don't even know if I may have heard this from you, Laura, or I may have heard it from somewhere else, but it was something about someone was doing their paper on police brutality, and they were like, I can't find articles that are pro-police brutality. And it's like, you're not going to find anything that's pro. Like, you might find something that says it's not as big of an issue as some people say, or you might find stuff that's saying it's a gender issue, they're more rough with men than women, or it's a racial issue and all that stuff. So those still count as different perspectives. But yeah, it's definitely not always a, like, I'm anti-police brutality. Well, I'm pro-police brutality. Yep.
Yeah, and it's interesting because the next layer of that is that when the argument comes up among certain circles, they won't be using the term police brutality anymore because they'll be advocating for greater latitude of treatment available, you know, when you've got somebody you believe is an offender. Now, I'm not staking a claim on this myself. Quick disclaimer here, but it is interesting that, you know, one of the research lessons is that what begins with a certain characterization of a position gets radically reframed, sometimes in Orwellian ways, sometimes in ways that just kind of expand your horizons when you hear another group talk about it. And it's important to be aware of that.
Right. And
well,
this also, go ahead. No, it's all you.
Well, I'll say one thing about that because it came up in our meeting the other day. But the use of words and like people's assumptions about what they mean. I mean, first of all, words obviously change, like especially like appropriate, politically correct, or whatever words they change and stuff like that. But also even things like we use the word technology a lot. That was the example that came up in our meeting. And people have a certain image in their head of what technology is. It's usually something computer or like computer gadget based. But really, technology is a car. Technology is like a door that opens. I mean, so you have to consider when you're doing your research and you're typing in words and you're like, why can't I find anything about technology and blah, blah, blah. It's like maybe you need to be using a more specific term or a different term. And so that's just, I just wanted to throw that out there because that's something we had talked about, and I think it's something students struggle with. Same thing with another good example, social network. I mean, people think Facebook. Well, a social network could be a network of people who know each other socially. It doesn't have to be like a website. So it is something to consider. Anyway, sorry, go ahead, Ryan.
No, it's okay. Yeah, that ties in. So going along with, you know, getting outside of like binary thinking and how different people or different perspectives you can take on a particular issue, looking to, you know, certain disciplines or certain lenses, I guess, how people think about certain issues or even just terms. I mean, people use terms differently given the discipline, right? Epistemology means something different to different groups of people, and the ways that people think about things change given how they're looking at it. I mean, I use the example of, I always pit philosophers and psychologists against each other for some reason. That's not charitable, and I don't endorse that. But It is true that they think of certain ideas differently, right? Lying, for instance, is different as a philosopher thinks about it. Thinking about what is a lie, what constitutes a lie. When a psychologist thinks about lying, is like, well, why do we do it? Who do we do it to, etc. I use the Supreme Court as making decisions at the Supreme Court is different in the sense of what is constitutionally acceptable is different than how we think about things philosophically in terms of law and how things should exist. So going to stuff with the library searches and databases and things, maybe talking a bit about the research guides and how things are separated by discipline can help with this.
Yeah. Well, and earlier when Gardner asked about, where would you go if you were looking for information about education, once the student gets enough background information and has kind of narrowed down their topic a little, I would recommend some of the education-specific databases because we have some really, really good ones. The research guides, actually, should I try sharing my screen so that you guys can see it? Should I do that? Or okay, he's saying yes. All right, let me see if I can figure this out because I've only done Google Hangouts like one time before. But let me see. Okay.
Yeah, I'll simply point out the little meta point here that you're seeing a research librarian do on-the-fly research by exploring her environment. And that's completely awesome. All about the meta moments.
We love meta in the library.
Do you guys see the library's website coming? Okay, cool. So let me just show people how to get to the research guides so that they kind of know what I'm talking about. If you start at the library's website, library.vcu.edu, all you have to do is go up to this thing that says research and then research guides. And I'm going to increase the size so people can kind of see what's going on here. The research guides, there's a bunch of different categories at the top: subject, courses, VCU groups and programs, how do I. Usually what you're going to be looking for is guides by subject, and you can see, allied health, anthropology, architecture. It's broken down by most of the majors that we have at VCU. So again, to use the education example, scroll down a bit, and you can see education right here. And then once you click on that, then you have more options: art education, regular education, law, and music. And so I'll go into education. We have this wonderful picture of Marilyn Scott, who is our liaison to education. And she created this guide, and what it is it highlights all the best resources for education majors. And you can see at the top, sometimes people miss these at the top here, but it starts out at the home page, but there's also articles, books, reference books, etc. But these two right here at the very top of the home page, ERIC and Education Research Complete, these are the places I always take students just because they're such good resources. So Education Research Complete looks like this if you open it up. And it kind of looks a little complicated because there's just a lot of stuff going on here. There's these 3 boxes, and if you scroll down, there's all these different options. I just tell students just to type a keyword into one of the boxes. So again, with my iPads example, just start by just doing a search and see what comes up. And then you'll notice we get a lot of results. So it may be a situation where you have to kind of narrow it down or use the sidebar to limit your results. But what this database provides, and what many of our databases provide, are mostly scholarly articles, although you do have like book chapters, periodicals, newspapers coming up too, but they are subject specific. So if a person does the search for iPad in the VCU library search, they're going to get thousands and thousands of results, and they're going to be all over the place. There might be some education-related stuff, but there'll be business-related stuff. And then if you go here, you're getting stuff that is specifically dedicated to education. So it makes it a little less intimidating, I think, for students because you're probably going to get fewer results, easier to comb through. But also, if it's going to teach you kind of how educators speak, because they're going to be articles that are coming from education journals and have that kind of language and those kind of issues. So,
Jenny, do you want to point out the abstract and the subject heading, since you kind of alluded earlier to how helpful those can be to language development?
Indeed. So let's look at this one right here that's right in front of me. Preliminary study on teachers' use of the iPad in Bachelor of Education program at a private university in Malaysia. So this long paragraph here is the abstract, which basically is a summary of the article. And I always recommend students read it because sometimes you can't really tell what an article is about just by the title alone. And then below it are the subject headings. And what I can do here is if I actually click on the title of the article, because I think these will come up as links. Yes. All right. So we still have the abstract here, but now the subject terms are linked. So if you say, oh yeah, teaching aids and devices, that's what I want to read about, you can click on it, and it opens up onto a new page that has all of the articles with that subject heading, and you can see that that's actually a lot. That's like 20,000 results. Anything else that I'm not seeing here that I should be pointing out?
So I would just one quick thing, and this is from my own experience as a student way back when. I even found the word abstract a little disorienting at first, because I kept thinking, well, it must be a summary, but it's a technical term that I don't usually find, so it must be something more than a summary, and maybe I don't even know what an abstract is. So, I mean, how do you talk to students about the specific language of scholarly communication in ways that open it up and not kind of multiply the confusion?
One thing to do is put it in context. So if you can describe to a student, all right, so these researchers they conduct original research, they write a paper, it gets published in a journal. A lot of times they might want to present their work at a conference, and they're going to be asked to send in this abstract as a way for people to get a sense of what they're going to be talking about without actually here's the entire 12-page paper or whatever. So if you can kind of give the context for what does abstract mean? Why do people care? What's going on there? And the other thing I do is I talk a lot of times when I explain peer review, I explain it pretty transparently. Like I say, this is what happens. Like a person does original research, they send it to a journal, but that journal isn't just it's not gonna just accept everything. So it has to go through this review process where a group of that person's professional peers read it and judge whether or not it's good research, the sample size is big enough, all that kind of stuff. And then if it passes muster, it gets published. And I have a feeling students are able to understand that because they themselves have possibly engaged in peer review on a smaller scale, and they also understand, oh yeah, that makes sense, that there would be this kind of vetting process. So it takes a concept that seems out there, and it puts it in context and makes it make sense to the students.
And you'll hear us constantly looking for metaphors and analogies to try to tie kind of the scholarly process or the academic research process, as it's traditionally defined anyway, to slightly more tangible ideas. So, for example, the subject headings we looked at, we'll often kind of describe those, and this has gotten much easier in the past few years, as hashtags and things like that. We'll often describe searching in VCU Library Search that Jenny mentioned previously, which is our big box search right on the library's website, versus a discipline-specific database at, going to the Wegmans hot bar versus going to, I don't know, the Whole Foods hot bar. They're just different. They have qualitative differences. Or even going to Target to buy a pair of shoes versus going to DSW to buy a pair of shoes. We spend a lot of time looking for ways to try to connect it to something more familiar, because it can be very esoteric. And I think we forget often just how esoteric it can be.
Mm-hmm.
So esoteric is an interesting word because I think it links back to one of the original points that students are having to interface with a variety of different languages. It's esoteric from a particular point of view if I'm not familiar with that language, but a discipline-specific language to those who are engaged in that discipline, it's not esoteric to them. It's a form of communicating effectively and efficiently. So I think that just as you all pointed out with You know, when you do your searches and look at the concepts and ideas that you're using, the words, explore the assumptions behind those words, I think there's a lesson to be learned here that we need to be conscious, dare I say mindful of how we use words, and we need to be conscious that if we're entering into a specialized language, we need to attempt to see that language from that point of view. Because if we deem it esoteric, we could be prematurely judging it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's something that we talk a lot about at the library. Like, and a lot of judgments are made. You know, we'll say something. I'm trying to think of a really good example. Like reference desk or like reference books will be like, students don't even know what that means. And in some cases they don't. They don't understand like what is reference versus research or, you know, something like that. And so we have to think of these ways to basically explain these concepts that are very basic to librarians who have, like, you know, like we talk like all the time about this kind of stuff and we know what we're talking about, but we have to we forget that students might not be familiar with those terms. And, you know, but at the same time, you know, considering, you know, do you use a different word? Do you just explain the word you're using? How do you deal with that? So, yeah, that's something we struggle with a lot.
I'm curious to hear what y'all think are kind of some of the biggest barriers you anticipate for your students in the research process. We can make sure we kind of hit some of those high points if you'd like us.
I'll just jump in here. At least, well, a couple of my students have sent me emails about credibility. And Jenny, I posted some of the PDF files that you shared with us about judging credibility of sources. But if you could say a little bit about that, I think that'd be useful. You
Definitely.
And or Laura.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple ways to look at it. One thing is to consider that I try to say there's no bad resources, only inappropriate resources for the assignment. So a good example would be, generally speaking, you know, if you came across a blog that was had very racist opinions, let's say it was like a white nationalist blog, a lot of people would say, well, that's obviously extremely biased and they're just making stuff up. Oh, it's a terrible resource. Well, it might be. But if you're doing research on white nationalist blogs, it would be an excellent resource, right? It all depends on what you're looking for. And so, you know, it's people need to keep that in mind. That there's no, because students, I feel like a lot of students are looking for a simple answer, like what is the sign that this is a good, I think I can use this, it's good versus it's bad. And a lot of times, you know, there really is no one thing, because you can say, oh, well, peer-reviewed resources tend to be, you know, the most authoritative. But that doesn't mean that every peer review article that they find on their topic is going to help their research, and it doesn't mean that they wouldn't benefit from a variety of resources, including the so-called substantive article that we you guys talked about in the last chat, and we're always talking about it here, or even like the sort of example of the white nationalist racist blog, which would be like almost more of a primary or ethnographic resource. Right. So first, students need to learn that. And then as far as credibility goes, I mean, again, it depends on what you're researching. Like if you are researching the latest, you know, scientific evidence of a cure for cancer, then you probably want to look at peer-reviewed resources written by somebody who's a medical researcher in the field, and they can back up their evidence with statistics, information, all that kind of stuff. But then if you're looking at a different kind of thing, like the Great Gatsby example I had earlier, you know, you could look at both sort of the authorities, like literary critics on something like that, but you could also take in other perspectives that are not quite as hard-hitting or scholarly or however you want to describe it. So a lot of it is so dependent on what the person is researching. And I will also say that I believe in a variety of sources. If you're using all resources from the New York Times or nothing but peer-reviewed scholarly articles, you're probably not doing something right. Probably you could benefit from getting a mixture of different sources, because again, that's going to help with that scholarly conversation that we were talking about. Laura, did you want to jump in and say anything about that?
Yeah, I would just say there are so many, I guess, heuristics available for how to assess the appropriateness, and I really like Jenny totally owns that over at the library. I think that's the best way to describe it too. That it's really about the way you need to use the source and how that fits your needs. But my favorite kind of set of heuristics is probably the somewhat sillily named CRAP test, which some librarians out at Cal State Chico came up with, and it is currency, relevant, accuracy, authority, purpose, and then someone added an additional P, which is publication. So where you kind of consider the nature of the format and where it's coming from. And I know that's reeling through a lot of things, but I do think those 6 tenets are universal enough that they apply to any format of information. And that's something I think it's important that we, I don't know, as a world, get away from. Kind of what Jenny said, well, look to see if it is peer-reviewed or if it has a bibliography. Those are really important signs in many, 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 many cases of the quality of a resource. But you can't say that about a website. You can't say that about a YouTube video. Those formats, it just doesn't work. So I think this like broader idea of focusing on different tenets to assess the appropriateness of each source works really, really well.
Yeah. Another thing to be aware of is that just because a source looks pretty doesn't mean that it's right. And what Laura has used before is, oh gosh, I don't even know if we still find it, but it's that it's like the corn sugar farmers of America.
Oh, sorry, I'm pulling it up. Sweet.
Oh my gosh, it's
Palm, which sounds really.
Surprise. I don't even know if it's still. Are you finding it?
Yeah, I'm gonna pull it up right now. Hang on.
So excited.
It's this wonderful. It's this wonderful website, pro high fructose corn syrup, and it's trying to like debunk the myths. And really, it's like, I mean, it's got an agenda behind it. It's just like those commercials that you see where it's like, you know, how do they go? You know, oh, that has high fructose corn syrup in it. What are you, a doctor? You know, don't judge my snack or whatever. And it's like, it just cracks me up.
And can you guys see this right now? Do you see
No.
the website?
No.
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 Click share your screen, and then it should come up with an option.
I did.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. Let me see if I do it again. If not,
There it is. There it is.
So if you come over and look at the About Us section, yeah, it's definitely sponsored by the American Corn Refiners Association. So that kind of thing. It's a little bit of an extreme example, but I think Jenny's right that polish is not always the best indicator. They also list a tremendous amount of research, and it's legit. They list a bunch of peer-reviewed articles, things like that. But sometimes it takes a lot of really qualitative exploration of a source, I think, to understand fully what they are getting at.
Right.
So it's interesting and ironic, of course, that they talk about this in terms of research. But this brings up another point, which is often research is characterized as leading you to the final answer about this or that. And I remember the Tobacco Institute argued for years there's been no conclusive proof that smoking causes lung cancer. But how do you begin to think about arguments not in terms of conclusions, but a preponderance of evidence or presenting something, you know, in ways that are a little less prone to rigid definitions of what's the success of the inquiry?
This is an issue, I think, in our society today. I'm going to speak in generalities. Our society today has an issue, but you know, you can kind of see it among anti-vaxxers, climate change deniers, people where, you know, there is a lot of evidence on one side. There's evidence that the climate is changing, that humans play a role. There's evidence that you know, there's no evidence that you know, vaccines cause autism, but there is evidence that they do a lot of good for our society. And people, they say, well, yeah, but there's this one scholar, these couple scholars who are they're going rogue and they're telling the truth, and it's really hard to get people away from that once they believe in something, like once they get their, you know, once they are invested their belief, it's really hard to, even if you show them a million facts, they're just not gonna, you know, take it. So I think it is important to teach people critical thinking skills, like the ability to look at all the evidence and kind of think for themselves. But I also think, yeah, the preponderance of evidence is, it's usually a sign, like, yeah, in some cases there's, okay, maybe, the tobacco industry could say, oh, well, this one study was done and it didn't show anything, but we could say, oh, but there's 100 studies that did show it. And also we can look at the studies and say, how many people did they look at for this one? 10,000. How many did they look at for the other study? 100. Okay, there's a difference there. And, you can make a judgment call based on that. I think for a lot of the stuff that students do for inquiry projects, they tend not to be, well, I guess I shouldn't say that, but I feel like there's more, it's less like, people tend to get their students to stay away from things where there's like a clear answer, like, does smoking cause lung cancer? Like, I would think that would not be the best project for inquiry project for this class. However, I would probably try to steer them towards something that asks more questions, like, I don't know, I mean, I obviously can't think of one off the top of my head, but something where there is no conclusive evidence, or at least there's various angles to take and look at it from. And then also that it's fine if you don't come to the ultimate conclusion. Instead, you say, here's, based on what I've read, here's what I think, but sorry, I got distracted by something. Here's what I think, but there's other information out there. There's other ways to explore this. Here are some things I didn't explore in my paper. And a lot of academic writers will do that in their conclusion. They'll say, well, we can't fully conclude, or here's something another, more further research could look into this, that kind of thing. So.
And I think that what Jenny just said, looking at the way, especially in scholarly and peer-reviewed articles, that most content concludes, it is almost never, ever, all right, we figured it out, guys.
Yeah.
It's just we're now contributing to a varied and diverse body of evidence. We're one voice in the conversation, and there's that conversation again. And I think that's really important. And I also really agree with a theme that I think has kind of come up a couple times at this point, that to me, there's such an emotional aspect of the research process, at least for me. That's probably why I'm a librarian. But I think if you're not left at the end of the project with wanting to ask so many more questions because you dug so deeply and because you were so engaged in the process, then maybe you're not done. You know what I mean?
I always tell students that a lot of times what they work on in University 200, if they really become fascinated with it, and they end up going into a major that makes sense for them to continue exploring it, like, you can build a little body of work in college. I mean, I was an anthropology major, and I focused on gender and sexuality, and almost every class I was in, I tried to, like, take the final paper and, like, look at it from the angle. Like, I took a tourism class, and I looked at gay tourism because I was interested in the gender and sexuality angle. And that's something that, I mean, if a student is really interested and fascinated with the topic, you can tell them this doesn't have to be the end of your research here, even though you are limited to how much you can write for this particular class. And I think for certain students, that's a very exciting idea, that they can become an expert in their own right. And then that's also something in the library world we've been discussing about students, and it makes sense. It actually comes at a perfect time because this is what this class is all about, students as knowledge and content creators. That you don't have to be just, oh, I'm just a little student, I don't know anything. You can say, no, I can start building a body of work, whether it's creative work, whether it's knowledge work, whether it's a combination of both, and carry that on throughout college and beyond. And I think that's, I don't know, I think it gives students more ownership of their research, and rather than being like, here's this product I have to produce to get a grade, it's more like, here's something I genuinely am interested in and have a stake in.
So that's a great segue to the part we haven't talked about yet, which is the fact that these inquiry projects are written for and will be living in the World Wide Web, which raises all sorts of interesting questions about things that we would take for granted in more of a term paper kind of a format, like citations. So let's talk about that a little bit. I have a feeling that Jason would want us to talk about citations. I just
Where is Jason?
Jason
buying a car.
He's buying cars for all of us. So
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Nice.
now that I've said that, it will come true, right? So we'll everybody
It has
writes.
to.
Yeah, exactly. So what about citations? We've got all these different scholarly formats depending on which discipline you're in. We've got the idea of hyperlinks. In the digital world, there's now this thing called a digital object identifier. There are permalinks. I mean, there's all this stuff with the common thread of how do you direct people to things that you've consulted for your own research. So let's talk about citations a little bit.
My thing before our hangout, my thing is the really most important thing to remember is what is the point of citation, and the point of citation for me there's two things. My battery power is low. Oh no, I need to plug in. Well, I'll say something and then I'll let Laura take over while I find a plug. What it comes down to is. You are crediting someone else's work. You have to give credit where credit is due. If you didn't come up with an original idea, you can't present that as your idea. The other thing is to leave a trail, to lead someone else to what you found. And so you can do that using hyperlinks, but it makes a lot of sense to do something like the article written by, Jimmy Fallon, I don't know why that came in my head, on, stand-up comedy.
There went Jenny.
Yeah, we lost.
You're on, Laura. You're on.
So I think Jenny and I were chatting some about this today, and actually while I was trolling the blogs, I saw a couple of examples, most of which it looked like someone had already piped up and said, hey, you might want to flesh this out. What I think is really interesting, I think the web affords us a greater deal of luxury and ease in the way we refer to other sources because we can just hop around. I mean, that's the beauty of the whole thing, right? Associative trails and whatnot. I do think, though, one thing that has to be considered, regardless of whether or not one adheres to a formal citation style, and it sounds like different sections of this course will do slightly different things, but there should always be enough information provided that someone can go back and get it, especially if it dies. So now I know that, we're not trying to create anything, y'all tell me if I'm wrong, that's going to last forever and ever in this section of 200, but even, links change day to day. They break their own. Yeah, and I saw a couple blog posts with some really interesting sources, but it would be phrased on the blogs as source 1, the word link, and then the link was a hyperlink. And that works as long as your link stays stable, but if it doesn't, and another big factor is that sometimes students don't realize, and I know we could go down a rabbit hole here. Well, let me rephrase that. People don't realize, this happens to everyone all the time, that they've entered something through the deep web. So they've gone to a portion of the internet where the link that they are looking at was never a stable link. It was generated just for their own viewing. That happens a lot when you're doing research in the library, for example. If you have to authenticate for anything, if you're asked to log in many cases, that link is not stable. So I think it's really critical that there's at least enough information about that item that the next person can find it when that link dies. Does that make sense?
That's a good point. Yeah.
And also, just to jump in really fast, it seems like even citations are a part of this conversation stuff we've been talking about. It's all audience specific. So, it's not the fact that psychologists like using APA just for the fun of it. They use it for particular reasons, or why historians use CMS. They use it because they like to see the footnotes always to be able to reference things as they're reading. And so even these things are very audience and purpose driven. I don't know if that helps the conversation or not, but
Ryan, I would add as we've said, we want our students to think of the research as being kind of in conversation with itself and with other sources. And I think what references, what citations do, is they make that conversation visible, evident. That I'm not the only one saying this. I'm now saying this as part of a conversation that was already started by others. So I think citations do that. And I'll just add, because Dewey, John Dewey said, what are your warrants? What warrants do you have for your knowledge claims? And that's what citations are. They're warrants for your knowledge claims. And so I always find that's a good way to think about it.
Yeah.
And I think it's a really interesting opportunity and kind of the very liberalized, web-friendly approach to this digital engagement in this course. We have such a great chance when we read scholarly versus other sources that we might find on the web, whether it's an article from the New York Times, the Atlantic, whatever it might be, to look closely at each item and say to yourself, if I wanted to track down how this person is supporting the argument they're making, would I be able to do it? And I think that's an interesting exercise. I find myself doing it all the time. Again, I realize I'm a librarian, and I probably do it more than most people. But even something that's really eloquently written, it can sometimes be a struggle to determine exactly what sources they're referring to if it's not written in a pretty standardized formal citation format. But in many cases, that's appropriate for the type of writing. It's just an interesting observation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Enoch. Yeah.
I was just going to say, is it fair to say that citation is like thought vectors or thought trails, being able to follow a conversation where you've been and also potentially see where it could take you in the future? And would you say that?
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, well, as one of you all pointed out, it shows the conversation structure, and I mean, people do like citation hunt, and there's different ways to do that. Like sometimes people actually and on Google Scholar you can do this too. You can see how many resources cited this article. So you can kind of get a sense of, like if an article is considered like just a seminal article in the field, it's probably been cited by God knows how many times. And you can kind of like trace it back and be like, well, this original article is the one that came up with this thought, the author came up with this concept that we all use now and stuff like that. And so you can kind of see like that person's thought vector, if you will, is like coming from a greater distance than, and you see the little offshoots, like, this kind of concept led to this kind of concept and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I mean, I definitely see it as, however, what metaphor you want to use, thought vectors, just shooting off at all angles, or conversation, or you can trace it back to sort of like the grandfather of a particular idea, concept, word, whatever, and then see like how things have evolved as more research has been done. And I think that's really good for students to know about. I mean, even if, even if we don't really, even if we've moved beyond certain theories and certain fields, we still pay tribute to the people who came up with those theories years and years ago. And that's something that, is part of being an academic, is to know your history, your academic history, and to give you a greater sense of where you're going in the future.
And I think Jenny just hit on a really great point about the research process that I would just kind of advise students to consider as they're engaging with their inquiry projects. And that's that in many cases you are going to find, just through searching, whether it's on the web, through the libraries, and we're covering a lot of conversations today. If any students have need for specific help, we are more than happy to do that on a very granular level. Sometimes that's the tricky part, is actually putting the pedal to the metal and finding the stuff. But so a lot of the time you'll search and you'll find these great resources just through the keywords that you search with and your search terms. Other students might find one good solid article that way, and then everything else they find is through really paying attention to what that person has cited, and what that person has cited, and just working through the entire conversation and network of citations or associative trails that's already available there. And more, I think we advise that. It's a really wonderful way to keep kind of a cohesive and focused line of research without getting overwhelmed by the scope of information that's out there.
I think we may have lost Gardner. Oh, no.
I had to go find my electrical power, so if mine goes down, the Hangout stops.
That 6% like went away real quick. It was like 6%, and then like 3 seconds later, boop. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, right in the middle of my Jimmy Fallon metaphor or whatever.
So I guess I don't know. We're coming up on the end of the hangout, or we've gone slightly past the time. But one of the things that I have been noticing in the inquiry projects is how important it is when the student begins to articulate the inquiry project to I guess in a professional way, but also in an effective way, say why they're interested in it. Often our interests have connections or origins from personal experience, or from a particular story of an encounter with a field of study. So I guess I'd ask the librarians, talk about the personal connection to research, that this is not really the same as experiments in a lab. It's about an inquiring mind, and our minds all are connected to our lives. So I'd be curious to know what you think about that.
I think I mentioned something earlier about the students' ownership of their research and encouraging them to consider the fact that if they are fascinated by a particular topic, there's no reason why they can't, kind of build on it in future classes, and kind of build up that little body of research. Yeah, I mean, I think that it's, it's difficult because I would say that most every student has something they're interested in. They may not be able to identify it right away, or they might say, "Oh, all I care about is TV," or something like that. But everyone has interests or things that they're like, "Huh, I want to learn more about that." Some classes are very conducive to letting people follow those lines of inquiry. This class is very conducive to that. 200 in general is pretty good. But I mean, it's difficult sometimes if you're, an English major and all of a sudden you get fascinated by gnats and you want to study the mating habits of the gnat. And then it's like, okay, can I, get into a biology class and do that? I was just thinking of Alfred Kinsey and his original research into gall wasps before he, became a sex researcher, a rather infamous one. It's, interesting to see how he went from one thing to another. And I really kind of do wish that it's difficult because, I mean, we have 4 years of college, it's expensive. In an ideal situation, you'd have way more time just to explore all kinds of different things you're fascinated with. And I think part of what we want to encourage at the library is this concept of being a lifelong learner, that you don't necessarily have to stop doing research when you leave college. You might do it in a different way than you did it when you had access to an academic library. But, I try to encourage people to become fascinated with their research, because I think that that's going to lead to a person who continues to have an inquiring mind beyond having to do it for college. And I think that's really important, because I think that your life is much more rich if you are interested in stuff and look into it. I feel like I'm rambling a little bit, but yeah, I mean, lifelong learning, that's something that I strongly believe in, and it's something that you can't really teach. It's something you can encourage, but it's up to the student or the adult or the human being to really become invested in that.
I think it's also really freeing to, I guess, acknowledge and admit your personal connections to your research, because I do think, hopefully, most researchers, be they students, adults, whomever, have them, because I do think that it makes it a stronger and more enjoyable process, to be honest, if you feel some connection to it. A lot of times when I'm working with a student, they'll have a question to the effect of, what are the advantages or disadvantages of parental involvement in helping children with their homework, something like that. And the research question is designed, of course, to make sure that they're asking it in an open way. But there's always this moment when I just say to the student, well, what do you think they are? And they will immediately be like, well, I think this because, when I was growing up, this is what we did. But I'm not sure if that's the case for everyone. And I think those moments are really, really freeing for the student to start to explore their research and think about their search terms. It's funny, it all comes full circle. In many cases, especially if it's a research question that kind of talks about cause and effect, advantages, disadvantages, things like that, actually considering your personal inclinations helps you at least to explore more fully by picking those words out that you think that might be factors in this question you're exploring can really help a lot too. So there you go. If you feel personal about your research, you have good search terms. Is that a good way to tie it up?
I love it.
Yeah. And also,
Go ahead.
I was going to say the other thing, Laura, that you kind of touched on is for people to figure out and admit their own biases when they do research. A lot of students pick topics that they are invested in one particular answer. And actually, it's funny because students will come to me and say, I wanted to talk about how video games can help people, but all the research I find is negative, and it's like, it's like, well, you're specifically looking, you shouldn't be specifically looking for one kind of answer and ignoring the rest. You should consider all the research that's out there. I think this class, like this sort of open writing and creation class, is a really good place to do that, is to say there is a juncture between my own interests and the research I do, but I shouldn't let the answer that I've always thought dictate how I'm going to do this paper. It's a good time to practice that, because part of college, I think, is also exploring things that you've previously learned and questioning, is that the only way to think about something? And this is an excellent class to do that in.
All right. Anybody have any other topics they want to bring up before we end today's Google Hangout? Okay. As we say in the biz, a motion to adjourn is always in order and cannot be debated. So a great debt of gratitude and enormous thanks to Laura Garapi and Jenny Stout, our two extraordinary librarians working with the course. You can see their contributions up on the top ledge of, maybe ledge isn't the right word because you jump off of those, right? But the top banner of, time for a nap, obviously. The top banner of our ThoughtVectors.net site, and this is by no means the last chance that you have to interact with our librarians. In fact, we hope that this Hangout has been a way of inspiring more questions and an even greater sense of urgency to be in touch with our librarians and help them help you as you focus your inquiry proposals. Thanks to everyone who joined in today, and a special thanks to our correspondent in Hanoi.
That's you, Bonnie.
What time
You're
is
muted,
it?
Bonnie.
What time is it in Vietnam, Bonnie?
Ah, she's muted. Yep. Yeah.
Here I am.
What time is it? She doesn't know.
We may not know.
1 a.m.
Really?
Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the speed of light and the planet Earth. It's 1 a.m. in Hanoi.
You're still muted, Bonnie.
I'm trying to do my best lip reading. Yes, Bonnie, what?
No, I'm sorry. If I come to the meeting tomorrow, it'll be 4 a.m.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
Yeah.
We appreciate your thought vectors, Bonnie.
Yes.
Time and space continuum.
There you go.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.
Talk to you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.